Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the ET Podcast.
Today we will be talking about The Lives of the Dead, a chapter in the book The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien discusses the theme of coping with death through the stories of Linda, Ted Lavender, and the various dead. Joining me today on today's podcast will be Nate the Great, a literary analysis expert, Dr. Smith, a PTSD expert, and finally, our guest of honor, Vietnam War veteran, Skizzy McBrizzy! In the chapter, The Lives of the Dead, there are many quotes. One of them reads, "There's the illusion of aliveness." In Vietnam, for instance, Ted Lavender had a habit of popping 4 or 5 tranquilizers every morning. It was his way of coping, just dealing with the realities, and the drugs helped to ease him through the days. To help explain this quote, here was one of our guests, Dr. Smith.
So this quote is basically showing the psychological progression of soldiers in Vietnam, where basically the majority of soldiers are looking for an escape, and in this case, Ted Lavender is popping tranks every morning. But actually, this is not an effective way of coping with traumatic events like this, because people who do this probably end up developing PTSD. So in the quote, it says that it's his way of dealing with the realities is using tranquilizers, but I would have to disagree with that because it's actually really just an escape, where the reason you hit tranquilizers or drink or do any drugs is in order to not have to deal with the realities. Actually, a more effective method with dealing with traumatic events like this, or especially for combat veterans, is that there's a study that said that if you write about your events in detail, you actually gain a better understanding of it, and that gain of understanding helps you deal with the traumatic event and becomes more reasonable. So that way, your PTSD becomes much less severe.
Another quote in the chapter The Lives of the Dead reads, "For a while, nobody said much. Then Mitchell Sanders laughed and looked over the green plastic poncho. 'Hey, Lavender,' he said. 'How's the war today?' There was a short quiet. 'Mellow,' someone said. 'Well, that's good,' Sanders murmured. 'That's real good. Stay cool now. Hey, no sweat, I'm mellow.'"
Yeah, in my experience, jokes were the only way to cope when it came to death in Vietnam. Notice how even after Lavender's death, Mitchell talks about his tranquilizers. Tim O'Brien really ties into his theme of overcoming death by remembering the deceased through who they were in this way. Lavender was mellow, Kurt was a kid. He uses these characters to showcase that theme. O'Brien discussed earlier how he wasn't able to joke about death before when he first arrived in the case of the dead old man. You know, that guy whose hands they played with and stuff? Just as some men turn to humor in stories, O'Brien turned instead to dreams, especially with Linda. We all have a way of coping. This is also something that O'Brien really tried to display in this chapter, that the dead live through the stories we tell. I once knew a friend in the army. His name was Paul. Real pretty face. One day, we were out on patrol and some gunfire broke out. Paul got hit, but it wasn't bad. He was airlifted out, and we got back to the base. When he hobbled off, he was punched through the face by a 50 cal, killed on sight. Did that actually happen? Maybe. But there was a man who did die in Vietnam, and I had to bring that home with me. This is the same with Tim O'Brien. The dead can't tell stories, so that means that we have to for them.
Viennoff came up to me on the school playground. "Your girlfriend," he said. "She kicked the bucket." At first, I didn't understand. "She's dead," he said. "My mom told me at lunchtime. No lie, she actually kicked the goddamn bucket." All I could do was nod. Somehow, it didn't quite register. I turned away, glanced down at my hands for a second, then walked home without telling anyone. I drank some chocolate milk and then lay down on the sofa in the living room. Not really sad, just floating, trying to imagine what it was to be dead. Nothing came to me. I remember closing my eyes and whispering her name, almost begging, trying to make her come back. "Linda," I said, "please." And then I concentrated. I willed her live. It was a dream, I suppose, or a daydream. But I made it happen. I saw her coming down the middle of Main Street all alone. And then later on the page it says, right then I started to cry. After a moment, Linda stopped and carried her water bucket over to the curb and asked why I was so sad. Well, God, I said, you're dead.
On page 224, Nick Veenhoff tells O'Brien that Linda has died, and when O'Brien finds out, his first notion is he didn't understand what had happened. In this passage, you have to read in between the lines. This is an elementary school O'Brien, so he's more than likely not at home alone. He just feels alone after the death of Linda. While O'Brien is home, he later sees Linda, and she comes up to him and tells him to stop crying. And when she asks why he's crying, he says, well, God, you're dead. But later, she says to him, Timmy, stop crying, it doesn't matter. And this matter is italicized because it is trying to emphasize the fact that death does not matter truly until no one remembers who you were. This chapter is titled The Lives of the Dead because the lives of the dead are carried on in our memories, and you're not truly dead until no memory of you is left. This is why Tim O'Brien tells stories to keep those he knows who have died alive.
So in conclusion, the symbolic representation of this chapter is the finality of death. The fact that this chapter is the very last chapter in the book, again, represents death, and how death itself is a chapter or the last chapter in many lives of people. And coping with death itself, in each person that has to cope with death, they have their own unique way of doing it. And Tim O'Brien's main way is by having the people who died live on through his stories. I would like to thank Matthew for technical contributions to this podcast. I'd also like to thank Nate the Great, Dr. Smith, and Skeezy McBreezy for their contributions to this podcast, as well as Meek Mill, Wiz Khalifa, and Rick Ross for their musical contributions to this podcast, and donations from listeners like you. Thank you.